Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
And now, the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to the Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Thursday, July 16th. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of the Federal Drive, can the Navy build the fleet it says it needs? We'll examine whether America's shipbuilding capacity and long-term strategy are aligned. Plus, why speed in defense contracting may be a competitive advantage all its own. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of the Federal Drive. We begin with this. The Space Development Agency is resuming deployments of its proliferated satellite constellation. The agency had to slow down the pace of its launches due to some technical issues, but its third in a series of Tranche 1 launches is now scheduled for July 16th. Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis is here with more details. Anastasia, great to have you.
Hi, Terry.
Tell us about what's happening here. The agency delayed some launches after they discovered problems with earlier satellites. What were some of the challenges they faced?
Yeah, so like you mentioned, the first launch took place in September 2025, but once those satellites were on orbit, once they reached orbit, SDA identified several technical issues that needed to be addressed. The director at the time said the agency needed to pause subsequent launches to fix those problems before moving forward. And the idea was at the time to have launches every month. So, of course, that is not happening anymore. But by the end of this mission, they will have half of their transport constellation on orbit, which will finally give them the ability to deliver the capabilities that they've been promising to warfighters. SDA's director says that the checkout this time will go a lot faster than it did last time. Following this launch, the agency wants they plan to launch 7 additional Tranche 1 launches, including 3 more transport layer launches and 4 tracking layer launches. Here's SDA's director and the program acquisition executive for missile warning and missile tracking, Gurpardab Sanhu, who goes by JP, talking about those challenges.
I would say that after the first launch, one of the things that you do before you launch is you predict the behavior of your system, right? You know, there's thermal models, there's point and control models, right? There's all the stuff that you have to make sure that things are stable. And there were some discrepancies in our modeling of what we saw and on orbit and what the prediction was. So that means 2 things. Either the model's wrong or your system is not what you think you're designed. In this case, there was some thermal. It was not that big a deal, but it does impact the total lifetime of the system. Thermal models were off, was number one. So we had to fix that. That required some additional thermal mitigation because, as you know, temperature is critical on orbit. Make sure that the things that are hot, they stay hot. The things that are supposed to stay cool. The second thing was when we went to the checkout of the first plane, the amount of time that we had on ground entry points was not planned well. So we needed additional ground entry points, and so we are trying to make sure, because it's one thing to launch, as I've said before, 1 satellite versus 21. Because the amount of time you get on each pass is very, very limited. So you have to be able to do things very quickly. And when they first come off the rocket, they are very, very clustered. So that whole coordination delayed us in the initial checkout for the first plane. And we plan to have a better sequence for this one going into it.
Those sound like some pretty significant issues, and hopefully they've got them fixed so that they're ready to launch the remainder of Tranche 1. What does that schedule look like?
So, like I mentioned, they wanted to have this monthly schedule. That's not feasible. They do have to, they're not committing to any timelines. They do have to have a schedule that they need to maintain just because of the processing facilities and the rocket availabilities. But like I said, they're not committing to any timelines. So while the agency has this like kind of overall launch schedule it needs to maintain, it's just not giving us any timelines. And also one thing that I wanted to mention is that it's a spiral development model that they've been talking about, and that's how the agency operates. So they're not waiting on things to finish. They're working on Tranche 1 and Tranche 3. So they're kind of launching those things without waiting for certain things to finish. So here's JP again.
We want to make sure the team has enough time And just to be frankly, to be honest, our first launch was in September, second was in October, and we still quite have finished some of those checkouts. So the goal here is not to launch on a monthly cadence. The goal is to launch and get quickly through the checkout so we can get to operations. And that requires enough confidence in the system that we'll get through the checkout pretty quickly. The nominal checkout. I would like to get to a nominal checkout. If it takes, say, 3 weeks of delay to launch, and that does not cause me 4 months of delay off the checkout on orbit, I'll rather take the 3-week launch delay versus a 4-month checkout delay. That's kind of math we are doing, but the goal is to get operational as quickly as possible once you get in orbit.
Anastasia, what does that mean then for the schedule for future tranches of this system?
So it's kind of the same thing. Whoever is ready to launch, they'll launch it. They're working with the vendor instead of having a schedule to adhere to. They go to whoever gets through the checkout, kind of assembly, integration, and testing, ready to launch, and then they're coordinating that launch. Here's JP again.
Right now, we're looking at York launch this week. We believe that between Northrop or Lockheed will be the next one, the transport. Then I think we might be able to get a tracking launch after that. And then the rest of the, because remember, York has done the launch already, so they learned a lot on the first launch that we fixed on the second launch. Lockheed's had a launch, and they're fixing stuff that we saw on the first launch for the second launch. When Northrop does their first transport launch, I'm sure we will find issues that I want to make sure we have enough time to fix those issues for the second plane launch, and then we'll get to the tracking pieces. We are still constrained by the OCTs, optical terminals, and some of the flight software issues. OCT supply chain is still is a factor in getting our satellites to the pad. So that's where in Tranche 2. Tranche 2, we are in better place in terms of schedule.
SDA also just recently announced almost $2 billion in contracts for satellites that will support Golden Dome. Are these satellites part of that, or is there something else?
So these satellites, 36 satellites to be precise, they are going to be part of Tranche 3. They are in support of Golden Dome. Overall, satellites are going to be part of Golden Dome in a way, but also in a way they will not. But these particular 36 satellites will support Golden Dome.
That's Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis. Anastasia, I know you'll be back with more updates on this program. Thank you.
Thank you.
You can find her story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, the Navy wants a larger fleet, but it's not clear that America's shipyards, suppliers, and workforce can deliver it. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network.
Print servers in federal environments create risk and unnecessary complexity. Every new printer, location, or policy adds strain to infrastructure that was never built for today's demands. FedRAMP High Authorized Printer Logic eliminates print servers with a secure cloud-native, zero-trust solution designed for federal IT. With advanced security, centralized control, and simplified management, agencies can modernize print without added burden. See what secure serverless printing looks like. Visit Vasion.com to learn more.
Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. The Navy's latest shipbuilding plan lays out an ambitious vision for future fleet growth. But every plan ultimately runs into the realities of industrial capacity, skilled labor, and production timelines. Some analysts say those constraints deserve as much attention as the size of the fleet itself. And here to discuss whether the Navy is planning a fleet it can't produce or a fight it may not fit is the Jeane Kirkpatrick Fellow at AEI, Anand Toprani. Anand, it is great to have you on the show. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks for giving me the opportunity, Terry.
The Navy has just put out a detailed shipbuilding plan, and AEI has published a critique of it at the highest overview level. What would you say the headlines are?
The headlines of this plan are what I would say is an attempt to try to increase the size of the fleet beyond the Biden administration's target of roughly 380 ships. Now we're seeing a sort of total force of about 450 ships, and a significant number of them are going to be unmanned systems as well. But the big headline, I would say, are two things. One is a massive increase in the shipbuilding budget from roughly in the $40 billion to over the mid 40s to over $60 billion a year. and the inclusion of the Trump-class battleships into the shipbuilding plan. This is an attempt to try to articulate what the so-called Golden Fleet would actually look like.
The paper describes its critique in 4 categories: the good, the bad, the vague, and the ugly. So let's kind of take those in order. Let's start with the good, and it has to do with the industrial base. Walk us through what you're seeing there.
Well, I think there's an acknowledgement that there's 2 major constraints limiting the Navy's ability to sort of generate new forces. One is the problems within the shipyards themselves in terms of the acquisition of labor, and most importantly, the retention of skilled labor, but also decrepit and decaying infrastructure, particularly in our public yards, but even in our private yards to a large extent. So you're seeing this sort of real constraint on our ability, not just to create additional forces, but also just to keep the fleet where it is, to keep pace with the number of retirements, which happen inexorably. Whether or not you build a new ship, the ships you have are going to retire, are going to age out, they have to be replaced. So there's problems within the yards, but there's also wider problems within the defense industry as a whole, the way it operates, the way defense acquisition and procurement works, whether or not we are actually getting the best bang for our buck. So I'd say, again, there are 2 sort of broad problems. There's an infrastructure problem within the shipyards themselves. Infrastructure is both physical and human, but also wider issues about how it is we manage defense. And there's an attempt on the part of the plan to talk about these issues, perhaps in a more detailed way in the past. And that is certainly a welcome acknowledgement of the problems that we face.
Acknowledging the problem is always the first step on the path to recovery, but throwing an extra $20 billion at an insufficient industrial base doesn't seem like a path to solution. Does the plan have or articulate any particular strategy for strengthening that industrial base other than just spending more money?
I mean, it talks about, well, we need to actually not just recruit workers, but we need to actually retain them. I mean, it makes a rhetorical commitment towards doing that, but having actually visited, one of these shipyards and talked about the issues that they confront, I mean, I still remember somebody at Electric Boat telling me, we pay a kid $18 to paint a submarine. And I didn't realize that painting a submarine is actually a very complicated sort of thing. It's not just like painting, painting your house, painting your wall. They said, we offer a kid $18 to paint a submarine. They can go down the road to Burger King and earn that much. I mean, we're just not going to be able to compete at the prices that we pay. And so one of the problems you're seeing is, are you actually able to offer people enough money to be able to sort of retain them, even once you've recruited them? The numbers I saw from Electric Boat in terms of how many people they're bringing into average classes and how many are actually staying with the job. I mean, there's a catastrophic sort of mismatch between how many people you bring in and how many people stay. And so the work is dirty, dangerous work. I think we really need to acknowledge that shipyards are still, in many respects, 19th century sort of, workplace environments. It's not a job that I would want to do, and I study this for a living. It's not a job I would want other people necessarily to do, considering just, again, how difficult, the work is. And so if you're going to actually do something about that retention problem, you've really got to modernize the infrastructure as well. But you've also got to break out of the system where you've got to be able to pay these people enough so that they're willing to stay. And the portion of the problem we're running into is that a lot of these contracts that we have are cost plus contracts, which very clearly stipulate how much you can actually pay these people. Unless you work on a different incentive structure, one that sort of encourages people to seek efficiencies at the expense of accepting higher profit rates, you're really not going to be able to deal with the retention problem. And this also has to do, if I may, with the overhead issue as well. The shipbuilding report makes an argument that we saw in the 1980s, that we want to try to encourage firms to invest more of their own money and reduce the government's overhead costs. And that all sounds well and fine. I mean, why is the government paying for overhead when in the private sector, you would never pay for an overhead, you pay for the product? So there's a nice effort in the shipbuilding plan to say, yes, we should reduce our the investment burden of the government pays. But the flip side to that coin is you have to guarantee higher profits for firms. Otherwise, they're not going to make these investments. And guaranteeing higher firms for defense contractors who are already over budget, behind schedule, and have all sorts of negative press going back all the way to the merchants of death 100 years ago is just simply not a winning political philosophy. So there's, again, you're gesturing towards some of the problems we face in terms of generating new forces, but it's sort of half-hearted and not entirely well thought out because, as I keep reminding people, there are no new ideas in defense. There's just new ways of talking about the old problems. And I think it's really important that we step back and we look at these are problems we've had for a long time. Why were we not able to solve them in the past? And I think that's going to be a problem. I think that's going to sort of, no matter how much we spend, it's not going to generate, I think, the desired outcomes.
I'm really glad we started with the good there. What might you have to say about the bad?
So when it comes to the bad, I would say that there is an unimpressive level of jargon in this report, which must have sounded good when you were creating PowerPoint slides, but actually, if you actually try to implement it, I'm not certain you're going to actually be able to do. You haven't really thought through what the political ramifications of what it is you're saying are. So when you talk about sort of moving away from a compliance-based architecture towards a warfighting, architecture, this is one where requirements are sort of generated by warfighters, and we want to stop having bureaucrats tell us what we're doing and have input from the warfighter. Now, this is a point I didn't make in the report, but I'll make it right now, even though it'll get me in a bit of trouble. One of the problems the Germans had in World War II was they listened to what the warfighter had to say. And the warfighter is interested in taking combat data and making constant adjustments based on what their experience is in combat. And what you end up having with the Germans is incredibly over-designed, Baroque military systems that are constantly sort of being modified. You're not able to actually capture the benefits of economies of scale and long production runs. And so, and this is a point that, that Navy executives, past Navy executives have made to me, is that any sort of inputs that are going to come from the warfighter that are not informed by sort of engineering, real profound engineering knowledge, are actually not going to sort of, do what it is you want. They're not going to actually create changes that you can actually implement at a physical sort of level. But there's also this idea of somehow we need to speed up this process. We need to sort of, stop removing all of these different layers that are holding back the acquisition process, what have you. And this is a point that one of my mentors in defense, always made, is that you can speed up the process by limiting the number of people who have a say in what goes on. But the problem in Washington is once you start saying that certain people no longer have a say, they get very upset. And so the question is, who is not going to have a say? Is it going to be the Navy? Is it going to be the Joint Staff? Is it going to be OSD or OSW, depending on what the NDAA says? Is it going to be Congress? Which congressional committees? Is it going to be OMB? Like, there are lots of people with a vested interest because this is public money. And once you reduce levels of oversight over how public monies are spent, you generate a lot of political pushback. And that is not something that is, spelled out. If you want this thing to be faster, who is going to suffer as a result? It's not spelled out. Two other problems I'd say in terms of what's bad about this report, I'd say that, again, it repeats this mythology of, the big problem that we have in defense is we don't have a steady demand signal. And if we had a steady demand signal, firms would invest appropriately. Well, the problem is, for the better part of a decade, we've had a steady demand signal for manned attack and ballistic missile submarines. And as far as we can tell, production doesn't stay level. It doesn't go up. It goes down. All right. Steady demand has not increased the number of Virginias. Steady demand is not going to, stop schedule slippages in Columbia. That has to do with the earlier sort of infrastructure problems that I'm saying. And again, it's a reliance on corporate jargon or current OSW buzzwords about warfighting and lethality don't actually address the sort of real bottlenecks that we confront. And finally, yes, there is more than just a simple rhetorical commitment towards using unmanned systems, RAS, UAVs, whatever. Like, there's all sorts of different, buzzwords in terms that we use. There are going to be some robotic autonomous systems in this ship, in this plan, but they're only going to be a fraction of the of the total of the Navy's sort of total battle force. You're talking about roughly 80 RAS systems for 300 man battle force ships. I mean, that's not a huge amount of ships, and you sort of think to yourself, well, I thought the whole point about robotic autonomous systems is that you can build lots of them because they're a lot cheaper. But if we're only building a tiny fraction of them compared to our manned ships, that entails that they're actually that implies that they're not cheaper and they're not attritable. So we're creating more expensive ships that we can't afford to lose necessarily. There's no sort of concept that's spelled out, and maybe they can't in a plan for how you would actually use these systems. And it seems like if we're thinking about, well, what are the lessons about how to use these systems based on what it is we're seeing during current combat operations, it would seem like the value of these systems is generating mass and accepting heavy amounts of attrition in order to achieve specific combat outcomes. You're not going to be able to achieve mass and accept attrition if you've only got 80 robotic 80 RAS systems. So the term I use, which I'm going to copyright, is, this is just a traditional Navy shipbuilding plan with a little bit of drone washing. And ultimately, if you look at the balance of page, if you just look at the pages, the page counts in this plan, where is the emphasis? The emphasis is on building the same ships that we have been building for decades. And again, are these, leaving aside whether or not we can actually build and maintain those ships, are those the correct ships for the challenges the Navy is going to be facing in the future? Remains to be seen.
Ananto Prani is the Jeane Kirkpatrick Fellow at AEI. Anand, I want to follow on what you're just talking about there, because you were emphatic in your consideration of what the warfighter has to say about these ships. We've just been engaged in pretty significant naval operations in the Strait of Hormuz and in and around the Med, and with different, there's certainly a vision that future conflict will have a significant role for the Navy. What lessons are we learning from current ops that you would expect to see in this shipbuilding plan, but maybe don't?
So this is maybe going to shock your readers, but I'm taking it from a close friend in the service whose opinion I respect. The Navy has suffered one of the greatest humiliations of the post-war era recently. I just want to be very clear. What happened during the war with Iran was a catastrophe for the Navy. Not in terms of numbers of ships. Thank God we didn't lose any ships. Thank God we were able to sort of keep casualties, at a fairly manageable level. But a catastrophe in terms of what is the Navy supposed to do? How do we justify having this large, not only a large Navy, but a Navy that is capable of operating around the world, performing all these sets of complex missions? We said that first and foremost, the Navy is about preserving sea lines of communication, about freedom of navigation, about allowing global trade to flow, because America is a maritime nation and our interest depends on access, to overseas markets and overseas resources. And what the Navy to do? The Navy was put in a situation where you need to promote sea control, one of your basic core missions, and we failed. When the Navy can no longer do sea control over one of the world's most important global maritime choke points, the game is up. I cannot tell you at a conceptual level how horrific this setback was, because honestly, what is the Navy going to say in future? If I'm sitting in Congress and I hear some admiral talking about, well, we need to do all this because we need to preserve sea lines of communication, well, you already had that opportunity and you were unable to. Are you going to be able to do better in future? And here's the problem. I'm not certain that we're going to be able to do better in future. Not at a political cost that we're willing to bear, because what we're seeing about the nature of sort of modern warfare and the proliferation of these sort of systems and weapons, which again is not a recent thing, but we're finally, I think, reaching I hate to use this term, but a sort of a tipping point where we're not able to pretend that we can do things the way that we used to. Remember, the idea of using over the horizon sort of, missiles to attack ships That goes all the way back to 1967. Elmo Zumwalt said, "Hey, when the Egyptians sank an Israeli destroyer with missiles that were fired from the harbor that the destroyer didn't see, he said this is a new era of warfare." And 60 years later, that new era might actually have arrived. So you're in this position where you have these missiles and drones that are being fired that you cannot see until they are right upon you. There are significant numbers of them that are going to be coming at you. The cost exchange, just doesn't work. And so sea control depends on your ability to basically control the land from which those missiles and drones are being launched. But what we also saw based on what was, released in, the open source is actually degrading Iran's ability to fire these missiles and drones, destroying the launchers, and sites, proved to be incredibly difficult, as it has been throughout history. The great piece I read, on a Substack about how, we failed during World War I to hunt German V1 and V2 launch systems because it turned out that they'd moved them around and it was very hard to find them. We had these kinds of problems hunting for Scuds during the Gulf War. And now what do we see? We have these same problems hunting for, launchers in a cluttered ground environment. And so if you're not actually able to project power effectively on land, which would entail massive bombing campaigns and the insertion of ground troops, you're not actually going to be able to achieve sea control in contested areas like Hormuz. And so I think maybe there's a way to solve this problem. I don't know that there is, but it seems like right now the Navy is at a sort of, genuine crisis point. And this all comes back to the idea of, well, what exactly is this Navy supposed to do? And, traditionally that there are sort of four missions that the Navy, focuses on. There's sea control, there's power projection, taking your stuff from sea and hitting targets on land. There's naval presence, about crisis response, and then there's finally deterrence, which is a sort of separate mission for our ballistic missile submarines. What I'm concerned about is, are we actually going to be able to do sea control in contested areas right now? Because we saw it was incredibly difficult to do that, against Iran. Remember, Iran was able to sort of achieve these effects in Hormuz, not by closing Hormuz in the sense of there was an impenetrable, wall of mines that were sinking every single ship. You simply created a situation where, just like in the Black Sea, the risk was too high. And if private firms are not willing to accept the risk to cargoes, yes, some ships will get through, but we never managed to get more than a tiny portion of the daily traffic through Hormuz at any given point in time. And so you create a situation where these scenarios where access is constrained and private firms are not willing to accept those risks, and there's very little the Navy can do if you're fighting a quote-unquote limited war to deal with those problems. So again, I think the Navy's in a real sort of crisis situation in terms of, can it still do things like sea control, things that we would have considered feasible in the past? Is power projection possible or politically acceptable? In the case of Iran, I don't think it was. I don't think, for us to have expanded the war to that level would have sort of totally defeated the purpose. And so again, conceptual level of what is the Navy supposed to do? Can it actually achieve that in a contemporary naval environment, naval warfare environment? I'm not entirely certain.
And so just to kind of close this out then, I think that gets us to the ugly part, which, although the paper is very specific in certain critiques, I think gets to what you just highlighted, which is this is a plan that doesn't answer the right problem or the right question. So how do we get Navy thought leaders, members of Congress, the defense establishment to rethink what it means to field a national Navy?
So among my mentors in terms of naval warfare, an analyst makes an argument which I wish this plan also took seriously, which is that we conceive of naval power using the wrong metric. We think ships equal power, and that is actually not how it works. The focus on hulls is, if anything, counterproductive. The argument he uses, that I know other naval analysts in the DC area uses, you measure power in terms of actual missile launchers and tubes. You measure it in terms of your ability to actually destroy the enemy. It's not hulls that matter, it's launchers that matter. It's inventories that matter. It's the nature of your munitions mix that matters. The ships are not an end of themselves. They're just a means towards an end. But we're caught in this sort of trap where we can only conceive of naval power using ships because there's an entire political economy based around the idea that building ships is what the Navy has to do. And as long as we build enough ships, the Navy will figure out how to accomplish all of these, political aims and overcome these technological, and triumph in the sort of technological battlefield. And I think that is a real problematic way of looking at it because you're locked into doing things that you've always been doing in the past. The shipyards are organized to build certain kinds of ships. There's a certain, the way that contracts are allocated happens in certain ways. The industry has evolved in a certain way to produce the existing force mix. One of the most interesting things I learned when I visited Electric Boat is we claim to have two shipyards building attack submarines, Newport News and Electric Boat. What we actually have is just one shipyard assembling modules that are built in Quonset and in Newport News and are floated to Groton and assembled. In a sense, the firms have reacted very logically, and they have simply integrated production entirely towards achieving a certain outcome. So again, I think the most important thing we have to do is we need to ask ourselves, what exactly are the kinds of tasks that our Navy has to accomplish? Are you actually interested in sea control in a contested environment? That requires a certain mix. Are you interested in sea denial, about preventing an enemy from using the sea for their objectives, like an enemy might do in a Western Pacific scenario involving Taiwan? Are you interested simply in maintaining control of the blue water and ceding the littorals, to an adversary? That requires, a different force mix as well. Like one of the problems that we saw is if you're going to do blockade's a very labor intensive kind of thing. Like you need lots of sailors, you need lots of ships, and you need a lot of low end stuff to be able to do that. And again, the report talks about a high-low mix, an idea that, again, goes back to the 1970s. There's no new ideas in defense. But what do I see in this report? I see lots of the high end, very little discussion of what the low end means, because, again, low-end ships don't necessarily generate the same kinds of contracts and employment that high-end ships do as well. They might bring in new entrants into the industry, which would disrupt the existing model. So, again, what is this Navy actually supposed to do? And are we using the right metrics to measure combat effectiveness? And I say that, again, based on the kinds of scenarios that the Navy is actually planning for, I'd say numbers of hulls are not the most important thing. It's your ability to generate, actual lethality and your ability not to be killed, not to be seen. Those are the things that matter, first and foremost. And again, that's not a function of how many hulls you have. It's a question of what kinds of hulls you have and how you're planning to use them.
Anand Toprani is the Jean Kirkpatrick Fellow at AEI. Anand, I really appreciate you taking the time to walk through this report.
I appreciate you giving me a platform to be able to talk about these ideas.
We'll post this interview and a link to the report at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Coming up next, modern conflicts move quickly. A new report examines whether the Pentagon's contracting system can keep pace with the demands of today's battlefield. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Modern warfare puts a premium on speed. A new report argues that when the Pentagon can move quickly from identifying a need to fielding a solution, it can have a direct impact on military effectiveness. For more details, Federal News Network's Eric White spoke with Stephanie Halcrow, Senior Fellow at George Mason University's Baroni Center for Government Contracting.
Tell me a little bit about the idea behind this report and why you wanted to look at the concept of speed from acquisition or contracting to actually getting technology out to the battlefield. What made you want to investigate that portion of defense procurement?
Absolutely, Eric. Thanks for having me here today. So when my co-author, Dr. Jim Hassick, who is a research fellow at Stevens Institute of Technology, and I started to banter about what was going to be our next project, we said, let's pick something that, frankly, government has complete control of and is something that is at a tactical level. And so we thought, hey, let's look at contracting, because that applies with contracting, both government control of the process and it's at the tactical level. And frankly, it was unique. There wasn't much work or research done on it. So we thought we could have an interesting input and take on it. So that's what drove us to look at this speed and contracting activity.
Gotcha. Yeah, they don't make a lot of war movies about procurement officials buying up all the ammunition that's needed. When it came to speed within the Defense Department, what were some of the main findings that you saw when it comes to how fast the government is able to buy something and actually implement it?
Yeah, absolutely. So we really took a broad look at what were some of the advantages of speed in contracting? What were some of the power of speed, and what created contracting as the competitive advantage? And some of those, and this was industry-wide, not just in the military, and some of those included delivering value sooner, which is a point we make. Now, that's probably pretty obvious. But if you think about it, the sooner you can get somebody on contract, the sooner they can start work, right? And it is obvious, but I think people forget that. Something else that we looked at was that it reduces, or that we found was that it reduces overall cost. Again, something that somebody might say that's really obvious, but if I was to flip that on the head and say, contracting team, the longer it takes you to do this contract, the higher you drive the price, the more expensive it gets. I think that would really stop contracting teams and say, oh man, maybe we should think about going faster. There's a couple other items that we've found, but the final one that I want to highlight is that we really saw, in technology development, that the speed of contracting, the speed of which you could get the folks working on the technology could actually be the X factor, as we call it, of advancing the technology. And I don't think that's something that's considered at the tactical level with contracting teams, and I think it really should be.
We're speaking with Stephanie Halcrow. She's a senior fellow at the George Mason University Center for Government Contracting. Yeah, historians will tell you that one of the major advantages for the U.S. in World War II, Germany loses a plane, it takes years for them to replace that plane, where we would lose a plane and it was another one was back up in the air in a couple of weeks. People don't think about the tactical advantage that a sturdy contracting venue can provide. Fast forward to now, where the technology is clearly more advanced. How do they balance that with more advanced technology, where they're not just making tanks out of steel, they're making high capacity computers and AI technology, drones, all that new stuff? How do you balance speed with the complexity that comes with a supply chain that has gotten more diverse?
Yeah, so Dr. Haxick and I highlight a lot of different historical examples of how speed in contracting has either supported the military activities and provided a competitive advantage, or also examples of where speed in contracting has not resulted in great advantage. In fact, there's a part of our paper where we discuss the Competition and Contracting Act. And we actually say that the Competition but not Speed in Contracting Act, because the Competition and Contracting Act has really burdened the contracting community and really slowed everything down. But there are certainly highlights out there. So you mentioned World War II, and a more recent highlight is the MRAP program, where they didn't have any special authorities. They didn't have any waivers to do what they did. They used all the same rules and regulations and policies that were available to any organization at the time, but they just did it faster. They embraced speed, and frankly, the end result was lives were saved. And so you have these big ideas like in World War II, okay, we won World War II, but when you can directly link a single program and the ability to deliver that program to the warfighter actually results in lives saved, that is something tactical contracting teams should really embrace.
Yeah, I can hear the procurement official pounding on the speaker. Yeah, that all sounds very nice, but how do we actually go about doing that? So, you have some recommendations here on where you can speed things up, and it turns out it may just be all about shifting the focus to speed itself. How do you go about doing that?
Absolutely. So first and foremost, make the decision to go fast. A lot of people say, we need to go faster, but they spend months and months and months trying to figure that out. So make the decision to go fast. And this administration is definitely making those decisions to go fast. And I say that like at the highest policy levels, but this is something that the tactical teams need to do as well. In the programs, the contracting officers, the program managers, they need to make that decision to go fast as well. I would offer that, for those policy teams, for the folks on the Hill, to start talking about speed. And they already are doing this, but it's a real shift. It's a shift that's happened in the last couple of years. Frankly, when I was on the Hill, I talked about reform a lot. And I supported my boss in writing legislation that in every title, the word was reform. But I think it's very hard to think about how do you implement reform and how do you measure our success in that area. But man, when you start talking about speed and going faster, that's really easy to measure. And so I encourage policy folks to start talking about speed and to drop the term reform. I also find in the paper that investing in the workforce is important. I think every conversation circles back to the workforce. Most people, when they think about investing in the workforce, they think about training and education. But there's really a lack of investment and prioritization on providing the workforce the tools to do their job. The IT systems, the networks, frankly. If a network is down half the day, how can the workforce do their job efficiently? How can they move fast when the network isn't supporting them? So when the paper talks about we recommend investing in the workforce, it expands it broader than just training, just education, and think about the tools and the support infrastructure to do that.
You mentioned that the focus used to be on reform, and that wasn't without merit, right? I mean, there were some projects that were sped along too fast that maybe money was spent where it shouldn't have been spent, or the technology ended up not working in the end, or it outpaced its need. What can you say about balancing that with speed? Because you have to keep that in mind, no?
Yeah, sure. I mean, if you deliver a capability that doesn't work really fast, then there's not much goodness in that. But I don't know that is the characterization of the military procurement system. I think the characterization of the military procurement system is that they prioritize being careful over fast. And frankly, it results in not delivering anything or delivering something way behind the need. And so certainly that is something you need to be careful about, but I don't think that is the current criticism of the procurement system. And if it was, I would celebrate it. I would celebrate if they were delivering things so fast and they missed the mark.
Kudos to both of us for not using the term Valley of Death, but I guess I just did. What is it that is serving as potential speed bumps other than some of the past legislation that you had mentioned? Are there other things that are hampering one's ability to move fast in this space?
Well, that's just it. It really is a paradigm and an approach at the tactical level. As I mentioned about the MRAP program, they used all of the existing statutes, all of the existing regulations, all the existing policies. They had no special authorities and they were able to move fast. We see pockets of places across the military procurement system that are able to do this as well without special authorities. So I would say that this is not about needing any new legislation, needing any new strategies. It is about making the decision to go fast. And that can be done at the tactical level.
Stephanie Halcrow is a senior fellow at George Mason University Center for Government Contracting. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Eric. Great to be here and represent the Brony Center of Government Contracting at George Mason University.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Listen to the Federal Drive on your schedule. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Dozens of House and Senate Democrats are demanding answers from the Trump administration on its implementation of Schedule Policy Career. A letter sent to the White House this week calls for details about exactly how many positions have been reclassified and whether there are plans to add to the list of those stripped of their civil service protections. Here with more details is Federal News Network's Drew Friedman. Drew, thanks for being here.
Nice to be with you today, Terry.
All right, so for starters, let's catch up. Where do things stand now after Schedule Policy Career was finalized last month?
Well, after we saw that executive order from President Trump in early June, we now have close to 8,000 career federal employees across government who have been made at will and easier for agencies to fire. They can't appeal their reclassifications into the new schedule. And then there's also a bunch of other changes like changing a process that used to be at the Office of Special Counsel to an internal agency process if they believe there's a prohibited personnel practice against them, just as an example. But there's a lot of changes that, at the end of the day, take away their civil service protections. Trump administration officials have been very clear that there's no loyalty tests in this, and it's really just a matter of accountability. But of course, it's raised a lot of questions and concerns from the federal community as well. I think this latest letter is just the newest example of that.
Why did the Democrats say they want more details? What more could they possibly be asking for?
Well, what happened when the executive order came out last month is that the White House had an appendix or a list of all the types of positions that had been reclassified and at what agencies. But the way that the list was structured and the information that it had left, for some people, a lot to be desired. There wasn't, for example, an exact number of the affected positions. We only know that it's close to 8,000. We don't have a specific number. We also don't know their seniority levels, for example, whether they're at the GS-15 level, 14, or wherever else, and a lot of other details that are just not entirely clear from the White House at this time. So the new letter from Democrats says that the public and Congress deserve more information on this, on understanding very clearly, where people were reclassified, and just looking for more information on that regard.
Is that part of the steps that are being taken by each of the agencies to actually figure out which names go against those positions and flesh it out from there?
The way that it was set up before this was all finalized was that agencies were supposed to put together their own lists of what they proposed to be reclassified or what would be considered a policy influencing position in their agency. That list was then reviewed by the White House to determine whether or not people would be kept on that list, if it would be expanded or shrunk from there. But again, there's not a lot of transparency into the process right now of how agencies came to those decisions. And there's some questions about, for example, one position at one agency might be reclassified and the exact same title or same role at a different agency wasn't reclassified. So there's questions about, how they came to those final decisions.
Is that at the core of the concerns that the lawmakers are expressing here, a lack of inconsistency?
That is part of the concern, but there's also broader concerns about how this could change things for the nonpartisan nature of the career civil service. They worry about the possibility of losing people who have been in government for a long time, have a lot of expertise, potentially being fired and replaced with people who are maybe more willing to carry out the president's priorities and policies. And in their letter, they're looking for a lot more specifics as well. For example, how this breaks down across demographics, if it affected for maybe men versus women or people who have disabilities, people with veterans preference, a lot of details in that regard. And then also just a question of, what types of positions were affected. They had examples where HR employees, procurement professionals, people who are conducting scientific work at the CDC, all those positions were reclassified. And the question is, from them at least, does that go beyond what is meant to be a classification of purely policy influencing positions?
And so at this point, Drew, what are the prospects that Schedule Policy Career is going to expand beyond this roughly 8,000 folks on the initial list?
I would say as time goes on and as we see the weeks pass since that executive order, it's seeming more and more likely that the Trump administration will expand the list at some point. We don't have a lot of details on when that would happen, what types of positions would be added to schedule policy career. But if you look back to the Office of Personnel Management's estimate from 2025, they thought it would be about 50,000 positions. So that's more than 5 times what we saw in reality. OPM Director Scott Cooper has made some comments recently saying that he thinks the list will eventually expand, but didn't give a lot of details necessarily on what that would look like again. But it could get down. If you think about it, the initial list was mostly GS-15 level employees. So it's possible that this could trickle down to GS-14s, even some GS-13s, and just expand across the number of titles affected as well. Again, there's really not a lot of clear details, but there have been definitely some, discussion points from administration officials saying that this could be coming down the pipeline at some point soon.
Are you anticipating that this might become the subject of future hearings?
I think that is fair to say. And as we've talked about before, there's a lot of other changes to personnel policies in government, a lot of changes to the firing or removal discipline procedures. So all of that combined, I think, could raise some attention in Congress. This letter may be a first sign that this is something that they're going to be continuing to push on here.
And maybe the Congressional Workforce Caucus will get involved.
That's certainly possible as well.
That's Federal News Network's Drew Friedman. Drew, thanks for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you.
You can find her story at federalnewsnetwork.com. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Sandiford. Our web editor is Stephanie Wright. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.